Considered by many to be a golden age in American history, the 1960s was a seemingly peaceful time. Folk rock was in its infancy, with artists like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez beginning to make waves in the charts. Alfred Hitchcock was terrifying audiences with the psychological horror film Psycho, and Muhammad Ali was just beginning to establish himself as the greatest boxer of all time. The charismatic John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Richard Nixon in the 1961 election, spurring on the civil rights movement and giving it national support. For the naive, things were peaceful, but in the early years of the 1960s, while the Cold War was starting to reach its climax, the calmness began to wane and a dark shadow of wariness and paranoia was cast on the American public. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union quickly established themselves as global superpowers, but the vastly different ideologies between the two nations led to tension, with both countries wanting to establish dominance. In the 1950s, space was still virtually uncharted territory, with many people believing that space exploration was something out of a fantasy novel. But with the emergence of new science and technologies, the moon suddenly didn't seem too far away. The United States and Soviet Union both wanted to be the first country to explore space, and each side began their efforts. The space race lasted the entirety of the 1960s, with the two nations beginning to launch missions that were more and more advanced. And although this further raised tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, the next race they would engage in would have much larger stakes.
That's the atomic bomb exploding at Nagasaki. The film was taken in a B-29 many miles away. All of you who see this picture can judge for yourselves the extent of the menace to civilization of this new weapon.
In August of 1945, after 6 years of fighting, World War II came to an abrupt end when the United States dropped a series of atomic bombs on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This massive display of power shocked the entire world. The death toll was predicted to be somewhere in the 200,000s, and the devastation was immeasurable. As soon as the initial shock wore off, other nations began scrambling to assemble atomic bombs of their own. And although it seemed like the United States would be the only country with the capability of building nuclear bombs, the Soviet Union detonated their first bomb in 1949. With this began the arms race, a period of time in which the United States and Soviet Union were once again attempting to establish dominance over the other, but this time, each country wanted to prove that they had the superior weapons of mass destruction.
Dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, ducked and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
After having seen the aftermath of World War II, the American public was not naive to the annihilation that was promised by these weapons. This led to a massive surge in paranoia, with many people believing that a nuclear strike was possible at any time. The government did not ignore this, and their efforts to educate the public on nuclear attack only fueled the anxiety that was plaguing the nation. In 1962, the United States became aware of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles near the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from U.S. shoreline. The discovery of these missiles began the 13-day standoff known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The missiles were located on a Foxtrot-class submarine manned by the Soviet Navy. The submarine had 3 primary officers on board: Captain Valentin Savitsky, political officer Ivan Simonovich Maslenikov, and flotilla commander Vasili Arkhipov. The United States Navy discovered the submarine and began dropping signaling depth charges, which would have forced the submarine to the surface, allowing it to be identified. The submarine, called B-59, in an attempt to escape their American pursuers, began descending deeper into the ocean and eventually lost radio signal. It had not been in contact with the Soviet Union in days, and those on board quickly began debating whether or not they were under attack. Believing that war had broken out and unable to contact anyone for confirmation, the idea of launching the nuclear torpedoes quickly arose. Although Soviet submarines typically only required the captain and political officer's authorization to launch missiles, the B-59 submarine in particular required that all 3 officers on board agree to launch. Captain Savitsky, thinking that war had broken out and their submarine was under attack by the U.S. Navy, wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. Political officer Maslenikov agreed, and had this been any other Soviet submarine, the torpedo would have been launched at the United States. But B-59 required unanimous agreement between the 3 officers, and Vasili Arkhipov was against the launch. Argument broke out between the officers, but to launch the torpedo when unanimous authorization was not met would have been going directly against the submarine's orders. Arkhipov held firm on his stance and eventually convinced the other officers to surface and await further orders from their commanders, where they eventually found out the war had not broken out. When the submarine returned to the Soviet Union, they were met with animosity and contempt from their superiors. Although the crew followed the unanimous authorization policy, many of their comrades considered them cowards and thought that their actions were disgraceful. Despite the initially hostile welcome, many people understood that if the submarine had launched the nuclear torpedo, an all-out nuclear war was inevitable, and that Vasili Arkhipov was the only reason the torpedo was not launched. Many experts say that if the torpedo had been launched, the United States would have responded with nuclear weapons of their own, and World War III would have likely followed. A global war fought with the nuclear power that both countries were wielding would have ensured mass destruction and casualties, and possibly even triggered a major thermonuclear response. America was bracing for a nuclear war in the 1960s, but almost nobody knew how close we truly came to it. In 2002, while discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis, former advisor for John F. Kennedy, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., stated, "This was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history." On October 27, 1962, Vasili Arkhipov saved the world. And I bet you haven't ever heard of him.